On a grey March morning in 1943, inside a guarded building along Berlin's Tippitsufer, the head of German military intelligence stared at a set of numbers that refused to behave like numbers were supposed to. Admiral Wilhelm Canaris had spent his life surrounded by secrets, betrayals, and half-truths. But this was different. This was arithmetic. And arithmetic, unlike men, did not lie. The report claimed that a single American factory was producing a 4-engine heavy bomber every hour. Canaris read it again, slowly, as if repetition might weaken its meaning. It did not. The Ford Motor Company's Willow Run plant, according to agents operating thousands of miles away, was assembling B-24 Liberator bombers at a pace that exceeded the total monthly output of Germany's entire aircraft industry. Not annually. Monthly. The room was silent except for the distant hum of traffic along the canal. Canaris looked up at the officer standing before him, Major Friedrich Wilhelm Heinz, a man known for precision bordering on obsession. Heinz had verified the figures 3 times. The sources were independent, the channels secure, the math relentless. If true, the report did not merely contradict Nazi propaganda, it destroyed it. For years, the German leadership had assured itself that America was incapable of sustained industrial warfare, a nation of comfort, of consumer goods, of political division. The idea that such a society could outproduce the Reich, the self-declared pinnacle of order, discipline, and efficiency, was not just improbable, it was heretical. Canaris rose from his desk and walked to the tall windows overlooking the Landwehr Canal. The water moved slowly, indifferently, as it had when Rosa Luxemburg's body was thrown into it decades earlier. Empires rose and fell. The canal remained. And now, according to this report, the same indifferent mathematics that governed tides and currents was governing war. The Americans were not improvising. They were industrializing victory. The implications were staggering. The B-24 Liberator was among the most complex machines ever mass-produced, over 1 million individual parts. Hundreds of thousands of rivets, miles of wiring. Precision tolerances measured in fractions of millimeters. In Germany, such an aircraft was treated as a near-artisan creation, assembled by skilled specialists over long, careful months. Yet in Michigan, it was reportedly moving down an assembly line like an automobile. Canaris knew enough about America to understand why this was so difficult for Berlin to accept. German ideology framed industrial output as a function of racial purity, centralized authority, and obedience. America violated every one of those assumptions. Its workforce was mixed, its political system chaotic. Its labor force included women, minorities, immigrants, groups. Nazi doctrine dismissed as inefficient or inferior. And yet, according to these reports, that very diversity was being converted into productive power on a scale never before seen. This was not the first warning. 2 years earlier, in 1941, German military attachés in Washington had already sounded alarms. Reports sent back to Berlin suggested American aircraft production was approaching levels previously thought impossible. Hermann Göring, commander of the Luftwaffe and one of Hitler's closest confidants, had dismissed them with laughter. Americans could build refrigerators, he had said, not warplanes. That dismissal hardened into dogma after Pearl Harbor. When the United States formally entered the war, Nazi leadership reassured itself that American mobilization would be slow, inefficient, and riddled with labor disputes. Democracies, Hitler insisted, were incapable of sustained sacrifice. Racial mixing weakened discipline. Capitalism favored profit over endurance. By early 1943, those assumptions were colliding with reality. The intelligence now flooding Canaris's desk came from every direction. German networks in Mexico City reported casual conversations among American businessmen describing factories of unimaginable scale. Neutral diplomats traveling through Detroit described plants so vast they generated their own weather. Swedish engineers spoke of specialized machine tools designed for single tasks, operated by workers trained in days rather than years. Even intercepted correspondence told the same story. Letters from American workers to relatives abroad spoke not of struggle, but of routine. Long shifts, endless noise. bombers moving past at a steady, unstoppable pace. Canaris ordered further verification. He did not need it. He wanted it. Among those tasked with analysis was Oberst Nikolaus Ritter, head of air intelligence. Ritter was no ideologue. He had lived in the United States during the 1920s, had watched skyscrapers rise in months, had seen Americans treat scale not as a challenge but as an invitation. When Ritter finished reviewing the data, his conclusion was blunt. If the numbers were accurate, Germany had already lost the war, not in some distant hypothetical future, not contingent on battles yet to be fought, lost in the only way that ultimately mattered, through industrial arithmetic. The Reich could not replace losses at the rate the Allies could inflict them. Every German aircraft shot down represented months of labor. Every American loss was an inconvenience. The difference was not courage or skill, it was throughput. The most detailed intelligence came through channels the Nazi leadership trusted least and needed most: neutral nations. In Spain, Colonel José Ungría, officially an observer, unofficially a conduit, reported conversations with American industrialists who spoke freely, even proudly, about their production systems. One name surfaced repeatedly: Charles Sorensen, Ford's production chief. Sorensen, an engineer, not a propagandist, described bombers built the way automobiles once were, broken into tens of thousands of discrete tasks, each simplified, standardized, and repeated until error vanished through repetition. Workers did not build planes, they installed brackets, routed cables, drove rivets. One motion, one responsibility, performed perfectly, thousands of times a week. Women made up a massive portion of the workforce, so did African Americans. Teenagers managed logistics. Disabled workers operated specialized stations. Every available human resource was absorbed into the system. From a Nazi perspective, this should have caused chaos. Instead, it produced efficiency. Canaris understood the danger not just of the information, but of reporting it. Intelligence in the Third Reich did not exist to inform policy. It existed to validate belief. Reports that contradicted ideology were treated as sabotage. Bearers of bad news were accused of defeatism, sometimes worse. Still, Canaris pressed forward. He authorized extraordinary measures. Saboteurs inserted into the United States were instructed to delay action and gather proof. Photographs, shipping records, employee counts. Anything that could force Berlin to confront reality. One of those saboteurs surrendered almost immediately. During interrogation, he told the Americans something astonishing. German leadership did not believe the numbers. They thought Willow Run was a staged illusion, a cinematic trick, a bluff. Even when aerial photographs later confirmed the scale, parking lots filled with thousands of cars, rail sidings clogged with aluminum shipments, rows of completed bombers awaiting delivery, the response from Göring remained unchanged. The images, he insisted, were manipulated. The bombers, wooden mock-ups. The Americans were lying. For Canaris, this was the breaking point. Intelligence had done its job. Collection was complete. Verification overwhelming. Analysis conclusive. Acceptance was impossible. By the spring of 1943, the Reich was not losing because it lacked information. It was losing because its leadership could not process information that threatened its worldview. To accept the truth about American production meant admitting that Nazi ideology was not merely immoral, but mathematically wrong. And mathematically does not negotiate. As bombers continued to roll off the Willow Run assembly line, one after another, hour after hour, the gap between belief and reality widened into a chasm. German factories strained under shortages of labor, materials, and power. American factories multiplied output with calm, relentless regularity. The war was no longer a contest of armies. It was a contest of systems, and one system had already solved the equation. By the time Allied bombers began appearing over German cities in formations that stretched from horizon to horizon, the outcome that Admiral Canaris had feared was already taking shape. It was not sudden. It was not dramatic. It was incremental, mechanical, and utterly unstoppable. Every month, American factories delivered more aircraft than Germany could hope to destroy. Losses that once would have crippled an air force were now absorbed without hesitation. Squadrons vanished and were replaced. Crews were lost and replaced. Entire air fleets regenerated as if the war itself were consuming machines faster than men could count them. Nowhere was this more evident than in the skies over Europe in early 1944. When the 8th Air Force launched its first deep penetration raids into the Reich, German planners expected a pattern they understood: limited formations, predictable routes, a scale that could be met with concentration and sacrifice. What they encountered instead defied precedent. Hundreds of bombers flying in disciplined streams, escorted by fighters that stayed with them all the way to the target and back. For Luftwaffe pilots, the experience was disorienting. Veterans, accustomed to facing dozens of enemy aircraft, suddenly found themselves attacking formations numbering in the hundreds. Ammunition was expended quickly, fuel ran out faster than expected, and when one wave passed, another followed. Adolf Garland, one of Germany's most respected fighter commanders, would later describe the moment the truth became undeniable. He had climbed to intercept what he believed was the main American formation, only to realize it was merely the first. As he descended, more bombers filled the sky behind it. And behind those, this was not bravery. This was production. Behind every formation lay an invisible infrastructure stretching back across the Atlantic. Training fields in Texas, aluminum smelters in the Pacific Northwest, rail lines converging on Michigan. Assembly lines where bombers advanced inch by inch, station by station, indifferent to weather, enemy action, or ideology. In Berlin, this reality collided with denial. Albert Speer, Hitler's Minister of Armaments, understood industrial systems better than anyone else in the Nazi hierarchy. He saw the numbers, he read the reports. Canaris could no longer deliver openly. In private, Speer acknowledged what others refused to say aloud. Germany was being outproduced into defeat, but knowledge offered no protection. Speaking openly meant death. Speer attempted reforms, rationalizing production, dispersing factories, streamlining designs, but these were marginal adjustments against a structural imbalance too vast to correct. German industry, fragmented and constrained by ideological restrictions, could not match the American model of scale, specialization, and labor mobilization. The Reich still produced aircraft. In fact, total German production numbers would eventually rival Allied figures on paper. But paper concealed the difference. German factories built many different designs in small batches, each requiring unique tooling and training. American factories built fewer designs, in enormous runs, each refined for speed of assembly and ease of maintenance. One system valued innovation, the other valued throughput. By mid-1943, the consequences were unavoidable. American bombers no longer targeted cities alone. They targeted aircraft factories, ball-bearing plants, fuel depots, the very nodes German industry depended on. Losses mounted. Repair crews worked around the clock. Production targets slipped, and still the bombers came. Operation Argument, known to the Allies as Big Week, marked the turning point. For 6 days in February 1944, over 1,000 heavy bombers struck German aircraft production centers. The Luftwaffe committed everything it had. Pilots flew multiple sorties per day. Maintenance crews cannibalized wrecks to keep planes flying. It was not enough. By the end of the operation, German fighter losses exceeded replacement capacity. Veteran pilots were gone, replaced by hastily trained newcomers. Fuel shortages grounded squadrons that still existed on paper. The Reich retained factories, but lacked the means to protect them. For those who understood industrial warfare, the meaning was clear. Air superiority had shifted permanently. The irony was cruel. German intelligence had anticipated this outcome. The reports had been accurate, the warnings precise. The failure lay not in collection, but in belief. As Canaris was pushed aside and replaced by loyalists, unwilling to challenge leadership, intelligence ceased to be a tool for decision-making. It became an instrument of reassurance. Reports were filtered, numbers softened, reality delayed. Meanwhile in Michigan, the Willow Run plant reached peak efficiency, The assembly line ran nearly a mile long. Sub-assemblies arrived from every direction, converging with mechanical inevitability. Wings from one end, fuselages from another, engines installed with practiced speed, electrical systems connected by workers who performed the same motion thousands of times a week. By April 1944, the plant was producing a finished bomber roughly every hour, not as a publicity stunt, not as a temporary surge. As routine, the workforce reflected a society mobilized in total. Women made up a significant portion of the labor force, many of them entering industrial work for the first time. African Americans operated heavy machinery. Teenagers handled logistics. Disabled workers filled specialized roles. Every pair of hands mattered. This was not merely manufacturing, it was social transformation converted into output. The numbers alone would have shattered Nazi racial doctrine had they been acknowledged. The very groups dismissed as inferior were building the machines that would devastate the Reich, not through sabotage or subversion, but through discipline, repetition, and competence. Back in Germany, consequences cascaded outward. Strategic planning failed to adjust. Aircraft continued to be diverted to offensive roles long after air defense should have been prioritized. Resources flowed into experimental weapons that promised miracles but delivered too late. The gap widened. By the time Allied forces prepared for the invasion of Western Europe, the skies belonged to them. On June 6, 1944, thousands of aircraft filled the air over Normandy. German commanders could muster only a fraction in response. The imbalance Canaris had warned of had become visible to every soldier on the ground. This was the final proof. Not charts or reports, but presence. Aircraft everywhere. Constant. Overwhelming. Germany had not been defeated by a single battle or leader. It had been defeated by an equation it refused to solve, and the solution had been written line by line, rivet by rivet, on an assembly line in America. As the war entered its final year, the consequences of denial became irreversible. German cities burned beneath waves of bombers whose numbers no longer inspired shock, only exhaustion. Air raid sirens wailed so frequently that civilians stopped counting the days between attacks. Entire neighborhoods vanished overnight, rebuilt only to be destroyed again, and always the bombers returned. Inside the Reich's collapsing command structure, a grim understanding spread quietly among professionals. Pilots knew it, engineers knew it, economists knew it. The war was no longer being lost at the front. It was being lost on spreadsheets that no one in power was willing to read honestly. Albert Speer, increasingly isolated, recorded his despair in private. The scale of American production haunted him. Even if Germany achieved perfect efficiency, even if every factory ran without interruption, even if every worker labored without rest, it would not be enough. The disparity was structural. America was not merely producing more, it was producing differently. The United States had transformed war into an industrial rhythm. Inputs flowed predictably. Outputs were measured relentlessly. Costs fell as volume increased. Errors were eliminated not by punishment, but by process refinement. This was not improvisation under pressure. It was industrial doctrine applied to conflict. German leadership never grasped that distinction. Hitler continued to believe that willpower could overcome material disadvantage. Goering clung to fantasies of secret weapons and decisive moments. Reports that contradicted these beliefs were dismissed as sabotage or cowardice. The result was a system that punished truth and rewarded reassurance. By late 1944, the Luftwaffe was a shadow of its former self. Fuel shortages grounded aircraft that still existed on paper. Training programs collapsed as experienced instructors were killed or reassigned. New pilots entered combat with only a handful of flight hours, facing enemies who arrived in formations larger than entire air forces had once been. Every American bomber lost was replaced within days. Every German loss echoed for months. The tragedy was that this outcome had been foreseen, not by enemies, but by Germany's own intelligence professionals. They had gathered the data. They had verified it independently. They had even obtained visual proof. But in a regime built on ideological certainty, facts that contradicted belief became threats. Admiral Wilhelm Canaris understood this too well. By early 1944, suspicion surrounded him. His insistence on grim assessments marked him as unreliable, defeatist, potentially treasonous. He was removed from effective power, sidelined, watched. His network fractured. His warnings went unheard. When the July 20th plot against Hitler failed later that year, the net closed. Canaris was arrested, interrogated, and eventually executed in April 1945, just weeks before the war's end. So too were many of his colleagues, men whose crime had been accuracy: Hans Oster, Hans von Donanyi, others whose names never entered public memory. They died not for espionage against Germany, but for believing mathematics over mythology. As Allied armies crossed into Germany itself, the industrial imbalance became visible even to civilians. American supply columns stretched endlessly along roads. Trucks replaced horses. Fuel flowed freely. Aircraft patrolled overhead without challenge. The Reich that had promised efficiency and order collapsed under shortages and chaos. In April 1945, in the ruins of Berlin, American intelligence officers discovered a final German report on Willow Run. It was dated April 20th, Hitler's last birthday. The conclusion was blunt, almost bitter. The production figures were accurate. They had been accurate for 2 years. The warnings had been ignored. Germany had not lost for lack of information, but for lack of wisdom. By then, it no longer mattered. The factory that had once seemed impossible now stood as a matter of record. Willow Run had produced thousands of bombers. The cost per aircraft had fallen steadily as efficiency increased. The workforce had proven that skill could be taught, that repetition created mastery, that inclusion expanded capacity. The Nazi worldview, built on hierarchy and exclusion, could not compete with a system that mobilized everyone. After the war, surviving German officials spoke more freely. At Nuremberg, intelligence officers admitted they had known the truth early. Economists confirmed the numbers. Engineers acknowledged the impossibility of catching up. The failure, they said, had been psychological. To accept the reality of American production meant accepting that democracy was not weak, but resilient, that diversity did not dilute strength, but multiplied it, that authoritarian certainty could not bend physical limits, and that admission would have shattered the ideological foundation of the regime. One of the most telling encounters occurred decades later at a museum built on the site of Willow Run. A former Luftwaffe pilot met a woman who had once worked the assembly line driving rivets into bomber fuselages day after day. He asked her how they had built so many so fast. Her answer was simple. They went to work. They did their jobs. They trusted the system and each other. That simplicity contained the truth German leadership could never accept. Victory in modern war did not belong to those who believed most fiercely in their own superiority. It belonged to those who organized reality more effectively. Willow Run did not win the war alone, but it proved something decisive. That industrial capacity, once unleashed, obeys only mathematics, not ideology, not pride, not denial. German intelligence saw that truth clearly. German leadership refused it, and in that refusal, an empire collapsed.